He had promised himself he would never come back to Millbrook Falls, and for 10 years he kept that promise like a vow carved into stone. But promises made in anger have a way of rotting quietly in the dark, and by the time Daniel Cole turned 34, the rot had reached every corner of his life. The city that once felt like freedom now felt like a room with no windows. So on a gray Tuesday morning, with nothing but a duffel bag and a decision he couldn't fully explain, he bought a one-way ticket back to the small Texas town he'd sworn to forget. The bus ride took 11 hours, and somewhere around hour 7, Daniel realized he wasn't dreading the arrival anymore. He was dreading something else entirely, the possibility that nothing would be there to greet him, that the porch he used to sit on every summer evening had been torn down, that the woman who once told him she would wait, however long it took, had long since packed her heart into a box marked closed and moved on with someone who actually deserved her patience. He spent most of the ride staring out the window, watching flat fields blur into gas stations and gas stations blur back into fields, and somewhere in that gray rhythm his mind kept drifting to the last real conversation they'd had. He remembered the exact weight of the silence in her driveway, the way the porch light behind her had made her look almost golden, and the way his own voice had sounded like a stranger's when he told her that Millbrook Falls would never be enough for him. He hadn't believed it, not fully, even then. But ambition has a way of making cowardice sound like wisdom, and he had chosen the version of the story that let him leave without looking back. Her name was Abigail Reyes, and she had been the reason his chest still tightened every time he heard a certain kind of laugh in a crowded street, or caught the smell of honeysuckle drifting through an open window. He hadn't spoken to her in almost 9 years, not since the night he stood in her driveway and told her that staying in Millbrook Falls would mean giving up on everything he wanted to become. She hadn't cried. She hadn't begged him to stay. She had simply said, "Then go become it," and closed the door so softly it was almost worse than if she'd slammed it. The bus dropped him at the edge of town, and from there, he walked. The gas station on Route 9 had a new sign, but the same cracked pavement. The diner where he used to wash dishes for extra cash was now a vape shop, though the faded outline of the old lettering still ghosted through the fresh paint like a memory refusing to be erased completely. Everything familiar wore a slightly wrong face, the way a dream feels correct until you try to describe it out loud. By the time he reached Hollis Street, the sun had dropped low enough to turn the sky the color of a healing bruise, orange bleeding into violet. His legs slowed without his permission. Somewhere in his mind, a version of himself was already turning around, already deciding this had been a mistake, that some doors are better left closed once you've walked away from them. But his feet kept moving, carrying him past the mailbox with the dented flag, past the oak tree with the rope swing long since rotted away, until the house came into view. It hadn't changed. That was the first thing that broke something loose in his chest. The pale blue paint had faded a shade lighter, the shutters had weathered into something softer, but the porch stood exactly where it always had, wide and wooden and lined with the same white railing his grandfather had built by hand 2 generations ago. And there, in the fading amber light, sat a woman in a wicker chair, a book open on her lap that she wasn't reading. Daniel stopped at the edge of the yard, his breath catching somewhere between his ribs. 10 years should have changed her. 10 years changes cities and careers and the shape of a person's dreams. But Abigail looked up slowly, as though she had felt him arrive before she saw him, and in that instant, he understood that some things simply refuse the passage of time. She rose from the chair without hurry, setting the book face down on the small table beside her, the way someone does when they intend to pick it back up later when the interruption is finished. She walked to the top of the porch steps and stood there, one hand resting on the railing, watching him the way you might watch weather rolling in from a distance, not afraid of it, just aware of what it might bring. "You came back," she said. Her voice hadn't aged the way voices usually do. It was steadier now, quieter, but the warmth underneath it was exactly as he remembered, like coals that had never fully gone cold, only banked beneath the surface. Daniel opened his mouth to answer and found there was nothing there. Every sentence he'd rehearsed on the bus, every apology, every explanation about the years overseas, the failed relationships, the promotions that meant nothing at 3 in the morning, dissolved the moment he actually looked at her. He had spent a decade building a life that was supposed to prove he'd made the right choice. Standing in her yard, none of it felt like proof of anything except how much time he'd wasted convincing himself he didn't miss this place. "I didn't know if you'd still be here," he finally managed, his voice rougher than he intended. "Where else would I be?" she asked. And there was no accusation in it, only a plain, unguarded honesty that hit him harder than anger ever could have. She tilted her head slightly, studying him the way she used to study a difficult equation, patient and unhurried. "This is my home, Daniel. It always was. I never left it looking for you. I just never found a reason to leave it at all." He climbed the porch steps one at a time, each one groaning faintly under his weight, the same sound they'd always made, and it struck him that even the house had kept its voice while he'd spent a decade changing his. When he reached the top, he stopped a few feet away from her, close enough to see the small lines that had gathered gently at the corners of her eyes, proof that time had touched her after all, just gently, like a hand that chose not to leave a mark. "I thought you'd have someone," he said quietly. "A husband. Kids. I thought I'd get here and find out I was 10 years too late." Abigail almost laughed, though it came out softer than that, more like breath than sound. "I did think about leaving, you know. Twice, actually. There was a man from Austin, and for a while I told myself I could learn to want that life instead." She looked past him for a moment, toward the darkening street, and then back. "But every time I tried to imagine a future, this porch was still in it. I kept waiting for that to stop being true. It never did." The words settled into him slowly, the way rain soaks into dry ground instead of running off it. He had spent 10 years believing that leaving was an act of self-respect, that staying would have meant surrendering some essential part of himself. But watching her now, steady and whole and entirely herself, he understood that she had never needed him to complete her. She had simply chosen, over and over, to leave a door open in a life that was already full, not out of desperation, but out of quiet, deliberate hope. "I'm sorry," he said finally, the words arriving late but true. "For how I left, for how long I stayed away. I told myself I was chasing something, and maybe I was, but I never once stopped to ask if it was worth what I was leaving behind." Abigail studied him for a long moment, and something in her expression softened, the careful composure cracking just enough to let him see the years she hadn't spoken about. The nights she must have wondered if she was foolish for staying, the mornings she probably told herself to stop checking the road. "I'm not angry anymore," she said. "I used to be. For a long time, actually. But anger is heavy, Daniel, and I got tired of carrying it for someone who wasn't even here to see it." The porch light above them flickered once, the same broken fixture that had never been fixed, casting its familiar half-glow across the wooden boards. A breeze moved through the yard, carrying the scent of cut grass and something floral he couldn't quite name, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of everything they hadn't said in 10 years, settling comfortably into the space between them like it had always belonged there. Daniel found himself glancing toward the far end of the porch, where a second chair sat folded against the wall, the wicker slightly more weathered than the one Abigail had been sitting in. He didn't ask about it. Some part of him understood without needing an answer, that it had likely sat there for years, unused, waiting the way the rest of the house had waited, in case the day ever came when it would be needed again. It was such a small detail, an ordinary piece of furniture, and yet it told him more about the shape of her waiting than any sentence could have. "There were nights I almost called you," she admitted quietly, her eyes fixed on the darkening tree line beyond the yard. "I'd get halfway through dialing and then stop, because I didn't know what I'd even say. Come home felt too much like begging, and I promised myself a long time ago I wouldn't beg anyone to choose me, so I just didn't call. I figured if you were ever going to come back, you'd have to be the one to walk up that road yourself." "I thought about calling too," Daniel said, "more times than I can count. I'd get your name halfway typed out and then convince myself it was too late, that too much time had passed for it to mean anything anymore. It felt easier to stay quiet than to find out I'd already lost my chance." She turned to look at him then, and there was something almost gentle in the way she shook her head. "You never lost anything, Daniel. You just left it here, waiting for you to want it again." "I don't expect anything," he said eventually. "I didn't come back because I thought you'd be waiting. I came back because I finally understood that I'd been running from the one place that never asked me to be anyone other than who I actually was." Abigail reached out then, slowly, and rested her hand on his forearm, the touch light but certain, grounding him in a way no city ever had. "Maybe you didn't come back for me," she said. "Maybe you came back for yourself. But you're here now, and that has to count for something." He looked at her, really looked, and felt the last 10 years fold quietly into something smaller than he expected, not erased, but no longer heavy enough to carry between them. The porch creaked again as she stepped aside, wordlessly making room beside her, and Daniel realized that some invitations don't need to be spoken to be understood. He sat down beside her as the sky deepened into full night, the same stars beginning to appear over Millbrook Falls that had watched over this porch for as long as either of them could remember, patient witnesses to a story that had never actually ended, only paused, waiting for someone to finally come home and finish it.